So when I first came to Gustavus, I thought I was going to be an elementary education major, but I showed up for first year registration, and Doug Huff was the faculty member who assigned to help me sign up for classes, and he evangelized me. And I was in C2, so I couldn't take any of his courses, but he signed me up for Lisa Heldke's School and Society course that semester, and I loved it, and I took as many of Lisa's classes as I could in 4 years, and eventually worked for her as a research assistant. Thinking about this question, the study and discipline of philosophy as I see it right now, 8 years later, is about asking meaningful questions and learning to develop that habit and that practice and pursuing those questions. Questions can be powerful drivers of thought. Even simple questions like, what is this, why, or why not, can provoke new thinking and new reflective action. Questions can be disruptive, subversive, and even as annoying as a gadfly. In general, I want to start with this premise. Human beings avoid thinking if they can afford it. We can think of thinking maybe as an adaptive trait. Thinking enabled our ancestors to adapt to ever-changing environments. And like other living organisms, if we have a bias for equilibrium in our environment. So if we don't sense a need for change, we probably won't. We won't think if we don't have to. I see this in families who fall into familiar patterns. I see this in institutions and communities like congregations, churches. That's one of the things I'm always working on, is trying to get people to move, and there's a real bias to stay as they are. In institutions and systems and societies where change and adaptation is often difficult or slow, I see this bias. So if there's no stimulus to change our habit of thought or our ways of thinking, our ways of being, we'll probably try and stick to the status quo. Speaking for myself now, if the way I was able to find food to eat yesterday worked, and I had no reason to rethink or reflect on that action, I'll probably end up doing the same thing today and tomorrow without much thought. But when I was Lisa Heldke's research assistant, she once had me track down an article in Harper's Magazine called The Oil We Eat. And the author described how much fossil fuel is used in the production of meat and connected that to the war in Iraq and climate change. This article and my conversations with Lisa disrupted my habits of thinking and raised new questions for me. So I stopped eating meat for the next 5 years. The problem with equilibrium, as I see it, is it's not necessarily the same as justice. It's not equal to being ethical or logical. Equilibrium is not the same as health or wisdom. Our status quo's ways of thinking and being can even be maladaptive. Think, for example, of the status quo regarding fossil fuels in the midst of climate change. Looking back, one of the most important parts of my college education was encountering thinkers of different perspectives from myself, feminist thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois and Jane Addams. And playing with this theme of equilibrium and disrupting the equilibrium, I often think it's the thinkers and theorists raising the questions who have no reason to defend the status quo and have very good reasons to disrupt it and resist it that raise some of the most interesting questions for me. These questions continued. Their questions disrupted the scripts of privilege and internalized superiority that have been ingrained into my thinking and being as a white male. These questions continued for me after college as I was in anti-racism training through Lutheran Volunteer Corps and in a group at Luther Seminary that was focusing on creating conversation called Dismantling Racism and Living into Beloved Community. So I think we will always need meaningful questions to provoke human individuals, systems, institutions, and societies towards something greater than equilibrium. Philosophers can be the gadflies in the midst of status quo and habitual thinking. Is this ethical? Is this just? Why? Why or why not? What does this mean? The study of philosophy can give you the skills, habits, and attitudes and cultivate in you a love of wisdom that's greater than the love of the status quo. Beyond a bias for that equilibrium, that status quo, our inquiry can be driven by so much more. It can be driven by wonder, curiosity, passion, and even a sense of fun, enjoyment, and playfulness. How am I thinking about my philosophy major now? As a Lutheran pastor, I could talk about how my philosophy major prepared me for the task of reading an ancient text and trying to discern what that means for a contemporary community. I could talk about the kinds of questions that are asked of me when people are dying. I could talk about how I've grown as a writer, and a writer who uses writing as a reflective tool and not just a form of communication. As a citizen, I could talk about how philosophy shaped me as a reflective activist and trying to be a change agent. What I'd really like to share with you today is how I believe my philosophy major helps me to be a better leader of change. One of my roles as a pastor is leading change in an ever-changing environment. And in some ways, it's both an exciting and a difficult time to be a pastor. The patterns and habits of local congregations of the institutional church are no longer working the way they used to. Theology of the church, our understanding of the Bible, our relation to culture is changing very fast. Local congregations need the skills and attitudes of reflection and discernment to adapt. But how do we do that? How do we lead complex systems, complex people through change, especially if there are forces trying to keep things the same? When I was in seminary, I read a book called Leadership on the Line by Heifetz and Linsky, and I don't really want to go into the whole book, but there's one distinction in there that I've held on to, which is the difference between a technical challenge and an adaptive challenge. A technical problem is the kind of problem that we know how to fix based on past experience. But an adaptive problem, on the other hand, is one where no one really knows the solution yet. Things that we used to do are no longer working the way they did. In these kinds of challenge, we have to adapt our ways of thinking and being, and there's even a sense of loss of all of the things that were before. This kind of change requires reflection and experimentation. The importance of this distinction is that we often try to respond to adaptive challenges using technical solutions. It's kind of like the saying, if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Many human systems, institutions, and societies want to use technical solutions because they know how to use a hammer, even if that's not the way forward. So my point is this, that our world is full of systems, institutions, companies, and realities that require adaptive thinking and action. As a leader, asking questions is one of the most important interventions I can make to provoke change and to drive us towards something greater than equilibrium. And not just my questions, but the questions of a community. We need leaders who can be gadflies and reflective agents of change. Philosophers seem particularly well suited for this kind of leadership, and I believe my study of philosophy at Gustavus is helping me to be that kind of leader.